To a man like him, the working class is invisible. We are just part of the vehicle meant to serve and be ignored. Then one morning, with the privacy partition in my luxury SUV barely cracked open, I overheard his phone call. I heard his real plan for my daughter's trust fund. I heard the trap he was setting for my little girl. I could not believe my ears. I wanted to slam on the brakes, drag him out by his expensive Italian collar, and beat him into the pavement. But I did not scream. I did not pull the car over. I gripped the steering wheel, kept my mouth shut, and spent the next 3 months planning a wedding gift that he would never, ever forget. Before I tell you how I destroyed him, let me know where you are listening from in the comments. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you believe that a father will do whatever it takes to protect his family. It was a rainy Tuesday morning in downtown Chicago. I am Richard Caldwell. I am 70 years old, and technically, I should be spending my days playing golf or watching the waves roll in from my lake house. 30 years ago, I started a logistics company with nothing but a rusty tow truck and a mountain of debt. Through decades of sweat, sleepless nights, and ruthless boardroom battles, I built that company into a $300 million empire. I sold it a few years ago. I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. But retirement bored me. I needed a reason to wake up early to stay sharp, to feel the pulse of the city. So I kept a small, silent ownership stake in a luxury black car service. A few days a week, I put on a tailored dark suit, a classic chauffeur cap, and I drive. It keeps me grounded. It reminds me of where I came from. And more importantly, it makes me invisible. People in the back of a luxury SUV do not see the driver as a human being. They see a piece of furniture. They conduct their business, they argue with their spouses, they reveal their ugliest secrets, all while assuming the old man behind the wheel is too deaf or too stupid to understand. That morning, the dispatcher assigned me to a VIP pickup in the Gold Coast neighborhood. I pulled my black Cadillac Escalade smoothly up to the curb of a high-end luxury building. The doorman opened the glass doors, and out walked my 9 o'clock fare. It was Cameron Pierce. Now I knew exactly who Cameron was. My daughter Victoria, a 32-year-old pediatric surgeon, had recently introduced him to me over a brief chaotic video call as her new boyfriend. Victoria is brilliant in the operating room. She saves children's lives. But when it comes to the real world, especially the world of men and money, she has always been painfully naive. She has a heart too big for her own good. Cameron walked towards my car holding an umbrella. He was a hedge fund manager, or so he claimed. He wore a custom navy pinstripe suit that screamed new money. His hair was perfectly styled, not a strand out of place despite the wind. He did not make eye contact with me as I stepped out into the rain to open the rear door for him. He did not offer a good morning. He simply tossed a heavy, pretentious Italian leather briefcase onto the pristine leather seats and climbed in, shaking the rainwater from his tailored coat onto my floor mats without a second thought. I closed the door, walked around to the driver's side, and got in. I adjusted the rearview mirror. I could see his face clearly. He was typing furiously on his phone, his brow furrowed in irritation. I lowered the privacy partition just a fraction of an inch, a habit I developed, to ensure I could hear if a client needed a sudden change of destination. I merged into the heavy morning traffic on Lakeshore Drive. The rain was coming down hard, blurring the windshield, and the morning commute was a crawl of red taillights. "Step on it, old man," Cameron barked from the back seat, his voice dripping with condescension. "My time is worth $1,000 a minute. I do not pay for a luxury service to sit behind a garbage truck. Move this boat." My jaw tightened. I kept my eyes on the road. I did not respond. In my younger days, I would have thrown a man like him out onto the wet asphalt. I had spent 40 years sitting across mahogany conference tables crushing arrogant, loudmouthed executives just like him. I knew the type perfectly. Men who wore their wealth like a weapon compensating for a deep, hollow incompetence. They thought screaming at service workers made them look powerful. To me, it just made him look weak. But I swallowed my pride. I was playing a role. I was just the driver. "I will do my best to navigate the traffic, sir," I said, keeping my voice raspy and deferential, masking my normal authoritative tone. Cameron scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Just drive, and roll up that partition. I have private calls to make." I reached for the button and activated the motorized glass partition, but I let off the button a split second early. It stopped with a tiny, imperceptible gap at the top, just enough for the audio to carry through into the front cabin. I watched him in the rearview mirror. He pulled out a second phone from his inner suit pocket. It was a cheap plastic prepaid phone, a burner phone. My veteran business instincts immediately flared. A legitimate hedge fund manager dealing with multi-million-dollar portfolios does not conduct business on a $20 untraceable burner phone. That is the tool of a desperate man, a man hiding from someone. He dialed a number and held the phone to his ear. He let out a harsh, arrogant laugh. "Yeah, it is me," Cameron said, his voice completely changing from the polished, professional tone he used with my daughter into something sleazy and sharp. "Relax, I told you I have the situation under control. The margin call is not a problem anymore. I have a golden goose on the hook." I kept my foot steady on the gas pedal, weaving smoothly through the traffic, but my entire focus was laser-locked on that gap in the glass. "I am telling you, it is a done deal," Cameron continued, leaning back in his seat and rubbing his chin. "She is completely clueless. She is a gullible doctor. Spends 14 hours a day cutting open kids in the operating room. She has no idea how capital gains work, let alone offshore restructuring. I just use a few big financial words, act like I'm protecting her assets, and she signs whatever I put in front of her. The blood in my veins turned to ice. A gullible doctor. No, the wedding is moving up." Cameron laughed softly, a sinister, greedy sound that made my stomach turn. "I convinced her we do not need a prenuptial agreement. I played the romance card, told her true love does not need legal protection. She melted right there. I am telling you, it is almost too easy. It is like taking candy from a very rich, very stupid baby." My hands gripped the leather steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My daughter. My brilliant, kind-hearted Victoria. He was talking about my daughter. "What about the family?" the voice on the other end of the line must have asked, because Cameron let out a loud, mocking snort. "Her family." "There is no family to worry about," Cameron sneered. "Her mother is dead. Her old man is some retired, clueless fossil living out in a cabin by the lake. He is completely out of the picture. He does not know the first thing about modern finance. By the time that old fool figures out what day it is, the ink will be dry, the marriage will be official, and that $15 million trust fund will be sitting in our accounts in the Caymans. I will bleed her dry before she even takes off her wedding dress." A heavy silence filled the front cabin of the SUV. The rhythmic thumping of the windshield wipers sounded like a ticking clock. I stared at his reflection in the mirror. He was smiling. A smug, victorious smile of a predator who thinks he has already won the game. He had no idea. He had absolutely no idea that the clueless old fossil he was talking about was sitting less than 3 feet away from him, driving his car, listening to every single word. He thought I was invisible. He thought I was just an old man in a cheap hat. I did not hit the brakes. I did not turn around and choke the life out of him, even though every paternal instinct in my body was screaming at me to destroy him right then and there. If I confronted him now, he would deny it. He would manipulate Victoria. He would spin a web of lies, and my daughter, blinded by love, might actually believe him. I needed proof. I needed a trap. I needed to let him walk right into his own execution. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the cold, calculating executive inside me take over. The grieving, protective father stepped back, and the man who had crushed corporate empires stepped forward. "We are approaching your destination, sir," I said over the intercom, my voice perfectly steady. "About time," Cameron muttered, hanging up his burner phone and shoving it back into his pocket. I pulled up to the curb in front of his sleek glass office building. I stepped out into the rain, walked around, and opened his door. He stepped out, ignoring me completely, and walked away without leaving a tip. I watched him disappear through the revolving glass doors. I got back into the driver's seat, pulled out my own phone, and dialed a number I had not called in years. The hunt had officially begun. When you spend your life providing for your family, you assume your sacrifices build an impenetrable fortress around them. But money is just paper. It cannot buy character, and it certainly cannot buy true intentions. The greatest danger does not break down your front door. It walks right in, smiling, dressed in a tailored suit, holding your daughter's hand. Never let your wealth blind your instincts. Never ignore the quiet disrespect shown to the people who serve. A man's true nature is not revealed in how he treats his equals, but in how he treats the invisible people he thinks are beneath him. Have you ever caught someone showing their true toxic colors when they thought no one was watching? How did you expose them? Drop your story in the comments below. If this father's brutal revenge satisfied you, hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and stay tuned for the next story. The heavy, suffocating silence in the car was suddenly shattered by the harsh buzzing of a cheap phone. It was not the sleek corporate smartphone Cameron had been aggressively tapping on since he entered my vehicle. It was a sharp, grating ringtone coming from inside the breast pocket of his tailored coat. Through the rearview mirror, I watched him shift his weight. He glanced out the rain-streaked window, making sure we were still crawling through the heavy morning traffic on Lakeshore Drive, before pulling out a small, dark gray burner phone. In my 30 years of running a global logistics empire, I had dealt with every shade of corporate criminal embezzler and fraudster. I knew instantly that a man wearing a $5,000 suit does not carry a $20 disposable phone unless he is conducting business that cannot afford to leave a paper trail. I kept my eyes fixed on the taillights ahead of me, but my senses were entirely dialed into the fraction of an inch of open space at the top of the privacy partition. The motorized glass was designed to isolate the rear cabin, giving my wealthy clients the illusion of complete confidentiality. But I had engineered that tiny gap precisely for moments like this. Information is the ultimate currency, and as a chauffeur, you become a ghost. People forget you have ears. They forget you have a brain. To Cameron, I was just a pair of hands gripping a steering wheel. "Yeah, it is me," Cameron answered, his voice dropping an octave. The polished, arrogant tone he had used to insult my driving just moments ago evaporated. It was replaced by a slippery, tense urgency. "I told you to wait for my signal. I cannot talk long. I am in a car." He paused, listening to the person on the other end. Then a low, cruel chuckle vibrated through the cabin. "Relax. I told you I have the entire situation under control. The margin call is not going to ruin us. I am not going to let them liquidate the fund. I have a golden goose on the hook, and she is practically begging to be plucked." I eased the heavy SUV forward as the traffic inched along. The rain pounded against the roof, a rhythmic drumming that masked the sound of my own breathing. I had no idea who he was talking to, but the predatory nature of his words made my veteran instincts flare. He was not talking about a corporate merger or a standard hostile takeover. He was talking about a person. "I am telling you it is a done deal," Cameron continued, shifting his legs and crossing one ankle over his knee. "She is completely clueless. A total bleeding heart. She is a surgeon, spends 14 hours a day cutting open kids in the operating room. By the time she gets home, she is a walking zombie. She is so buried in saving lives and playing the hero that she has absolutely no concept of how capital gains work, let alone offshore financial restructuring." A cold prickle of unease started to crawl up the back of my neck. A pediatric surgeon. The description was oddly specific. I thought of the countless nights I had stayed awake in my empty house worrying about my own daughter's brutal shifts at the hospital. I thought of the sacrifices I had made to ensure she could focus entirely on her medical career without ever having to worry about the ugly, ruthless side of wealth. "I just throw around a few big financial words," Cameron boasted, his tone dripping with profound disrespect. "I act like I am protecting her assets from post-marriage tax hikes. I tell her I am taking the burden off her shoulders so she can focus on her little patients. It is almost pathetic how easily she buys it." I put the paperwork in front of her last night, poured her a glass of wine, rubbed her shoulders, and she signed the whole stack without even reading the fine print. My hands tightened on the leather steering wheel. The leather groaned slightly under my grip. A sudden, terrifying dread began to pool in my stomach. I told myself it was just a coincidence. Chicago is a massive city. There are hundreds of pediatric surgeons. There are thousands of wealthy women being manipulated by greedy men. It was just a coincidence. Then Cameron spoke the name. "Victoria is not going to be a problem," he said dismissively. The world outside the windshield seemed to stop. The red brake lights of the cars ahead blurred into meaningless streaks of color. The heavy rain hitting the glass sounded like a distant, muffled roar. My heart seized in my chest, a violent physical jolt that stole the air right out of my lungs. Victoria. My Victoria. My mind violently snapped back to the phone call I had received less than 12 hours ago. It was late evening. I had been sitting on the porch of my quiet lakeside cabin nursing a glass of bourbon when my phone rang. It was Victoria. Her voice had been trembling with a breathless, overwhelming joy. She told me that she had wonderful news. She told me that she had met someone incredibly special a few months ago, a brilliant finance guy who treated her like a queen. She apologized for keeping him a secret, explaining that she wanted to be absolutely sure before bringing him into our world. And then she dropped the bombshell. He had proposed. They were engaged. She was so happy she was crying. Now, sitting in the driver's seat of this luxury vehicle, the sickening truth locked into place. The brilliant finance guy who had swept my brilliant, trusting daughter off her feet was the parasitic fraud sitting less than 3 feet behind my head. My vision tunneled. A primal, violent rage surged through my bloodstream. The executive in me, the man who calculated risks and engineered complex strategies, was screaming to be unleashed. I wanted to slam my foot on the brakes in the middle of the highway. I wanted to rip the partition down, drag him out of the back seat by his expensive Italian collar, and beat him into the wet pavement until he forgot his own name. I wanted to physically dismantle the man who was plotting to destroy my little girl. But I did not move. I did not flinch. I kept the car rolling at a steady, perfectly even pace. If I confronted him now, it would be a disaster. He would deny everything. He would spin away to Victoria. He would play the victim, and she, blinded by this fabricated romance, would likely side with him. She would look at me as the paranoid, controlling father trying to ruin her happiness. I could not act on impulse. I needed to hear the rest of the plan. I needed to let him build the trap so I could lock him inside it. "A sweeping power of attorney," Cameron said, answering a question from the person on the line. "Full discretionary control over the assets. I can move funds, alter trust directives, and authorize wire transfers without her explicit consent on each transaction. As soon as the marriage certificate is filed, her individual wealth legally merges into our joint portfolio, and the power of attorney gives me the keys to the kingdom." I knew exactly what a sweeping power of attorney meant. It was a blank check. It was financial suicide for anyone who signed it. He had weaponized her exhaustion and her trust to gain total access to the $15 million trust fund I had established for her when her mother passed away. "No, we are not waiting," Cameron said, his voice dropping into a harsh whisper. "I already handled that. I convinced her to move the wedding up by 6 months. We are doing it this weekend, and the prenuptial agreement is gone. I played the romance card. I told her that a prenup means I do not trust her, that true love should not be governed by contracts and lawyers. I acted insulted that she would even suggest it. She felt so guilty, she literally tore the draft up in front of me." He let out another laugh. "It is almost too easy." I forced myself to breathe. In and out. Slow and measured. I was no longer just a father listening to a conversation. I was a general gathering intelligence behind enemy lines. Every word he spoke was a nail in his own coffin. The voice on the other end must have asked a final, crucial question. What about her family? Will they intervene? Cameron scoffed loudly, a sound of pure, unadulterated contempt. Her family. There is no family to worry about. Her mother is dead. Her old man is a retired nobody living out in a log cabin somewhere. He is completely out of the picture. From what she tells me, he is just an old blue-collar relic who got lucky a long time ago. He does not know the first thing about modern finance or wealth management. By the time that clueless old fossil figures out what day it is, the ink will be dry. The 15 million will be routed through the shell accounts in the Caymans. I will bleed her dry before she even takes off her wedding dress, and there is nothing the old man can do about it. The call ended. The sharp click of the phone shutting off echoed in the small space. Cameron shifted in his seat, sighing loudly, clearly annoyed that we were still in traffic. He had absolutely no idea that his entire world was about to end. He thought he was untouchable. He thought the working-class driver chauffeuring him through the rain was deaf-blind and irrelevant. He thought the retired nobody living in a cabin was a helpless old fool. I stared at his reflection in the rearview mirror. His smug, arrogant face was illuminated by the passing streetlights. The burning rage inside me crystallized into a cold, absolute certainty. He wanted to play a game of deception and financial ruin. He wanted to steal the future I had built for my daughter. I watched him put the burner phone away and pick up his sleek smartphone, completely oblivious to the death sentence he had just signed for himself. The traffic finally cleared, and I accelerated smoothly toward his destination. The hunt had officially begun. I did not go home after finishing my shift. I drove the black Cadillac straight to Chicago Memorial Hospital. The heavy rain from the morning had settled into a dismal gray drizzle by the time I pulled into the visitor parking garage. I changed out of my chauffeur jacket, leaving the cap on the passenger seat, and threw on a plain, unremarkable trench coat over my white shirt. As I walked through the sliding glass doors of the main lobby, the sterile smell of antiseptic and floor wax hit me. It was a smell I had always hated, a sharp reminder of the hospital corridors I paced when my wife was losing her battle with cancer. But I pushed the memory aside. I was here for my daughter. I checked the surgical schedule at the reception desk. Victoria had just finished a 9-hour cranial reconstruction on a young boy. I found her in the second-floor cafeteria. She was sitting alone at a small corner table, staring blankly at a lukewarm cup of black coffee. She was still wearing her blue surgical scrubs. The dark circles under her eyes looked like bruises. She looked so incredibly small in that exact moment, so completely and utterly drained of all her vibrant life. I walked over and sat down in the plastic chair across from her. She blinked, startled for a second, before a weak, exhausted smile touched her lips. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. She told me it was a surprise to see me in the middle of the day. I did not return the smile. I did not have the time or the stomach for pleasantries. I leaned forward across the table, making sure to keep my voice extremely low and completely steady. I asked her about the wedding preparations. I asked her how the financial restructuring of her trust fund was coming along. I watched her eyes. At the exact moment those specific words left my mouth, her entire physical posture dramatically shifted. The soft, exhausted daughter vanished, replaced by a defensive wall of sudden, sharp irritation. She pulled her hand away from mine and crossed her arms over her chest. She asked me how I knew about the restructuring. I told her I was her father, and it was my job to know when my only child was making sweeping changes to a $15 million portfolio. I asked her directly if she had signed a general power of attorney handing control to Cameron. Her jaw tightened. She looked away, her eyes darting toward the cafeteria entrance as if she wished she could escape the conversation. She sighed heavily, rubbing her temples. She told me I was overstepping my boundaries. The words tumbling from her mouth did not sound like my brilliant daughter. They sounded rehearsed. They sounded like a script she had been fed by a predator. "You are too paranoid, Dad," she said, her voice carrying a sharp edge of rehearsed frustration. "Cameron is a professional. He is just protecting my assets from post-marriage tax hikes. It is too complex to explain right now." I stared at her. The phrase echoed in my mind, too complex to explain. I looked at the dark shadows under her eyes, the slight tremble in her hands, from holding surgical instruments for 9 straight hours. A deep, heavy sorrow washed over me immediately, followed by a surge of burning anger, directed entirely at the man who had done this to her. After her mother died, I spent years fighting off corporate vultures, greedy distant relatives, and manipulative board members who thought they could swindle a grieving family. I built an impenetrable legal wall around Victoria, so she would never have to deal with the ugly, bloodthirsty side of extreme wealth. I wanted her to save lives. I wanted her to be good. I never wanted her to become cynical or suspicious. But sitting across from her now, I realized my protection had a fatal flaw. I had shielded her from the wolves outside the door, but I had left her completely defenseless against the wolf she invited into her own home. Cameron had weaponized her beautiful, selfless dedication against her. He knew she was too exhausted to read 50 pages of dense legal jargon after a grueling surgical rotation. He knew she trusted completely. I made sure to keep my voice perfectly calm. I did not raise my voice or my tone. I told her that signing a power of attorney before a marriage was highly unusual. I asked her to simply let my old legal team review the documents just to be absolutely certain everything was standard procedure. Victoria slammed her hands flat on the plastic table. A few nurses at the next table glanced over, but she did not care. She leaned in, her eyes flashing with a fierce, protective anger that belonged to Cameron, not me. She told me that I had always been controlling, that I never trusted anyone, and that my outdated way of doing business was insulting to the man she loved. She said Cameron was handling everything perfectly, and that I was trying to ruin the happiest moment of her life simply because I could not let go of the reins. She told me that the prenuptial agreement was off the table entirely. She said true love should not be governed by contracts, a phrase I had heard word for word just hours ago through the glass partition of my car. Hearing it from her lips made me physically sick. It was a flawless manipulation. I absolutely did not argue with her. Arguing would only cause her to stubbornly dig her heels in much deeper. If I pushed too hard, she would cut me out entirely, and I would lose my only window to protect her. I needed to play the role of the defeated, overprotective old man. I softened my expression, lowered my shoulders, and offered a gentle, apologetic nod. I told her I was just looking out for her. I told her I was sorry for interfering. Victoria sighed, her anger melting back into overwhelming fatigue. She reached out and patted my hand again, feeling guilty for raising her voice. She told me I just needed to get to know him better. She said I had been isolating myself up at the lake and that I was out of touch with how modern relationships worked. Then she delivered the final blow. She insisted that I host a welcome dinner for the two of them this coming Friday. She said I needed to host it at my modest lakeside cabin so Cameron could finally meet me face to face. She said it would be the perfect opportunity for us to bond before the wedding, which they had decided to move up to this very weekend. I looked at my daughter, smiling weakly. I agreed to host the dinner. I promised to be on my best behavior. I watched her walk away, heading back to the surgical ward. I sat completely alone in the sterile cafeteria, staring at the empty plastic chair. The dangerous trap was officially set. Friday evening arrived with a chilling breeze coming off the lake. I stood on the wooden porch of my modest 2-bedroom cabin, watching the headlights of a sleek silver Porsche cut through the gathering darkness. This cabin was my sanctuary, but it was also a carefully constructed decoy. Over the years, I had learned that immense wealth attracts parasites, just as surely as blood attracts sharks. When Victoria started dating in her early 20s, I purchased this unassuming, slightly weathered property at the end of a long dirt road. It had peeling paint, a sagging roof over the porch, and a rusted mailbox at the end of the driveway. I used it to filter out the gold diggers. If a man could not respect my daughter while believing she came from a humble blue-collar background, he did not deserve her. The Porsche came to a stop, its expensive tires crunching loudly against the cheap gravel of my driveway. The driver's door swung open, and Cameron stepped out into the crisp evening air. He was wearing a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than the roof over my head. He immediately looked down at his polished leather shoes, visibly disgusted by the mud and wet leaves coating the ground. He stepped gingerly, trying to avoid the puddles his face contorted in a sneer of absolute superiority. Victoria emerged from the passenger side, looking radiant and happy, completely oblivious to the profound disdain radiating from her fiancé. I walked down the creaking wooden steps to greet them. Victoria ran up and hugged me tight. I hugged her back, feeling a fierce, protective ache in my chest, before she turned to the man behind her. "Dad," she said, her eyes shining with genuine excitement. "This is Cameron." I extended my calloused hand. Cameron looked at it for a brief second before reaching out to shake it. His grip was weak. I looked him directly in the eyes, waiting for the spark of recognition. I waited for his arrogant smile to falter as he realized I was the exact same man who drove him through downtown Chicago traffic every Tuesday morning. But nothing happened. His gaze simply washed over me. To him, the chauffeur in the crisp suit and the old man in the faded flannel shirt were just invisible background props in his magnificent life. "It is a pleasure to finally meet you, sir," Cameron said. His voice was smooth, practiced, and utterly hollow. "Victoria has told me so much about you and this rustic little place of yours. It is very quaint." He used the word quaint, but his tone implied pathetic. I smiled warmly, playing the part of the clueless, easily intimidated senior citizen perfectly. "Come on inside," I said, gesturing toward the open door. "I have a roast in the oven and some wine ready to pour." We moved into the small dining room. The table was set with mismatched plates. I had purposely bought a $15 bottle of red wine from the grocery store. I poured a glass for Cameron. He picked it up, swirled it, and took a small sip. He immediately pressed his lips tightly together, fighting a grimace. "This is quite a robust vintage," Richard Cameron said, placing the glass back on the table with deliberate care. "Very aggressive on the palate." I suppressed a laugh. As he mocked my cheap wine, my mind wandered to the climate-controlled cellar beneath my actual city residence. I thought of the $10,000 bottles of imported Bordeaux, resting on custom mahogany racks, wines vastly more sophisticated than the fraud sitting at my rickety table. I could buy and sell this man 100 times over before breakfast, but I just nodded and offered a sheepish smile. "I am not much of a wine expert," I admitted, keeping my voice soft and unsure. "The clerk at the store said it was a popular brand. I hope it is suitable for a big city finance man like you." Cameron puffed out his chest. "It is perfectly fine, Richard. We cannot all be connoisseurs." Throughout the dinner, Cameron dominated the conversation. He spoke in long monologues about the stock market, using aggressive financial jargon designed specifically to confuse and intimidate me. He painted a picture of himself as a master of the universe, a financial genius who was single-handedly securing my daughter's future. "I understand you are managing Victoria's accounts now," I said, taking a slow bite of my roast. "She mentioned something about a power of attorney. That sounds like a lot of heavy lifting for a young man preparing for a wedding." Victoria tensed, shooting me a warning glance, but Cameron waved a dismissive hand. "It is nothing I cannot handle, Richard," Cameron said, his voice dripping with condescension. "The tax laws are shifting. Keeping her assets exposed post-marriage would be a massive liability. The power of attorney just allows me to streamline the transition. I know it sounds complicated, but I assure you it is standard operating procedure. You do not need to worry your head about it. I am taking care of your little girl." I nodded slowly, letting my shoulders slump, as if I were overwhelmed by his brilliant explanation. "Well, I am just a retired old man," I said, looking at him with trusting eyes. "I do not understand all those big words. I am just grateful a smart young man like you is looking out for her. It gives me peace of mind." Cameron practically glowed with arrogant satisfaction. He reached over and squeezed Victoria's hand. She beamed at him, completely oblivious to the fact that he was actively preparing to bleed her dry. After dinner, the conversation turned to dessert. Victoria stood up and began clearing the plates, insisting that she would fetch the apple pie she had brought from the city bakery. She turned her back and walked into the small kitchen, the swinging door closing softly behind her. The very second she was out of sight, the charming, affectionate fiancé completely vanished. Cameron's smile dropped. His posture stiffened. He let out a long, irritated sigh and immediately reached into the breast pocket of his expensive suit jacket. He did not pull out his primary smartphone. He pulled out the dark gray, cheap plastic burner phone I had seen in the rearview mirror of my Cadillac. He quickly tapped the screen, checking a message. The glow of the cheap screen illuminated his face, highlighting the greedy, desperate tension tightening his jaw. As his thumb swiped across the glass, he tilted the phone slightly. From my angle across the small wooden table, I could clearly see the screen. I saw the string of digits glowing at the top of the message thread. I burned the international country code and the number into my memory with photographic precision. He frantically typed a reply, his eyes darting toward the kitchen door to make sure Victoria was still occupied. I sat perfectly still, sipping my cheap red wine. The puzzle pieces were rapidly falling into place, locking together with terrifying clarity. He was tied to someone dangerous. The very next morning, I made a quiet phone call to the general manager of the luxury black car service. I still held a silent 51% stake in the company, a fact known only to a few top executives. I gave a simple, non-negotiable directive. From this day forward, I was to be the exclusive driver for Cameron Pierce on every single one of his scheduled routes. If he booked a car to the office, I was behind the wheel. If he needed a ride to a restaurant, I was the one pulling up to the curb. The manager did not ask questions. When you sign the paychecks, people follow orders without hesitation. By Monday morning, the trap was fully operational. The rain had cleared, leaving the city streets slick and gray. I parked the Cadillac Escalade outside Cameron's luxury high-rise precisely at 8 in the morning. I stepped out of the vehicle wearing my immaculate black chauffeur uniform and stood by the trunk. Cameron emerged from the revolving glass doors. As usual, he did not offer a greeting. He simply handed me his heavy leather overnight bag and his suit jacket, barking an order to place them carefully in the back. As I reached out to take the jacket from his hands, my eyes locked onto his left wrist. He was adjusting his cuff inadvertently, exposing a heavy rose gold watch. It was designed to look exactly like a Patek Philippe Nautilus, one of the most prestigious and fiercely coveted timepieces on the face of the earth. Now Cameron assumed I was just an uneducated driver who would be blinded by the shiny metal. What he did not know was that during my 30 years of building a global logistics empire, I had developed a deep, almost obsessive passion for horology. I am an avid collector of rare watches. I have 3 authentic Patek Philippe models resting in a climate-controlled vault in my home. I know the exact weight of the gold. I know the precise, flawless sweep of the second hand. I know the specific depth of the engraving on the dial. As my fingers brushed against his sleeve, I had a clear, unobstructed view of his watch for 3 agonizingly long seconds. I instantly spotted the microscopic flaws. The bezel was just a fraction of a millimeter too thick. The font on the date wheel was slightly misaligned. The metal lacked the distinct warm luster of genuine rose gold. It was a replica. A very expensive high-end replica, but a fake nonetheless. I closed the trunk and walked around to the driver's side, my mind racing with this new piece of intelligence. In the world of high finance, a man's watch is his ultimate status symbol. It projects power, stability, and untouchable success. Men who manage hundreds of millions of dollars do not wear fake watches unless they are desperately trying to project a level of wealth they absolutely do not possess. If Cameron was wearing a replica, it meant he was completely broke. It meant he was bleeding cash so fast that he could not even afford the basic uniform of his own profession. The arrogance he displayed was nothing more than a fragile, hollow shell covering a massive, terrifying void of debt. He was drowning, gasping for air, and my daughter's $15 million trust fund was the only life raft he could see. I climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and eased the heavy vehicle into the bustling downtown traffic. I kept the privacy partition cracked open exactly as I had done before. For the first 10 minutes of the ride, the back cabin was completely silent, save for the furious rapid tapping of Cameron typing on his phone. Then the silence was shattered by the harsh ringing of his burner phone. I glanced at the rearview mirror. Cameron's face was pale. A thin sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead. He answered the phone, skipping any form of greeting. "I told you I need more time," Cameron hissed, his voice trembling with a raw, undeniable panic. "You cannot do this right now. You promised me until the end of the month. You know I have the capital coming. The wedding is this weekend. Everything is signed." I kept my eyes on the road, carefully navigating a busy intersection, but I absorbed every single syllable. The person on the other end of the line was speaking loudly enough that I could hear the aggressive, muffled tone, though I could not make out the exact words. Whatever they were saying, it was tearing Cameron apart. "Listen to me," Cameron pleaded, his voice cracking slightly. "You cannot issue a margin call today. If you liquidate those positions now, the entire fund collapses. The board will demand an immediate audit. I will lose everything. Just give me 72 hours. The voice on the phone shouted something sharp and final. Cameron squeezed his eyes shut, leaning his head back against the pristine leather seat. "Where am I supposed to get $10 million by noon?" Cameron asked, his voice dropping into a desperate, hollow whisper. "I do not have it. The accounts are completely drained. The trust fund transfer takes 3 days to clear after the marriage certificate is filed. I cannot legally access her money until Monday. If you call the margin now, I am dead." I felt a cold, hard satisfaction settle deep in my chest. $10 million. That was the magic number. That was the exact size of the hole he had dug for himself. He had gambled with money he did not have lost at all, and was now facing total financial annihilation. The walls were closing in on him, and his only desperate hope of survival was to steal my daughter's money to cover his catastrophic losses. He was a cornered animal, willing to ruin an innocent woman's life simply to save his own miserable skin. "I will find a way," Cameron finally said, wiping the sweat from his brow with a trembling hand. "Just hold off the margin call until Friday. I will get you a bridge loan. I will leverage the new house. I will do whatever it takes. Just do not pull the trigger today." The call disconnected. Cameron threw the burner phone onto the seat next to him and buried his face in his hands. He took a series of deep, shuddering breaths, trying to regain his composure. By the time I pulled the Cadillac up to the curb in front of his massive glass office building, he had put his mask back on. He adjusted his tie, grabbed his briefcase, and stepped out of the vehicle without a word, acting as if he owned the entire city. I watched him walk through the revolving doors, projecting an image of absolute success to everyone around him. But I knew the truth. I knew he was a dead man walking. I knew he was exactly $10 million short of survival. And I knew that I held the only key to end his completely miserable scheme right here, right now. The French bistro Victoria had chosen for our lunch was a bright, airy space filled with the clinking of silverware and the low, sophisticated murmur of the afternoon crowd. I sat at a quiet corner table, nursing a glass of sparkling water. The sharp contrast between the elegant surroundings and the dark, churning reality I carried in my chest was almost suffocating. Just hours ago, I had been the invisible driver listening to a cornered, desperate fraud plot, my daughter's financial ruin. Now I was playing the role of the doting, oblivious father. Victoria arrived exactly 10 minutes late, a whirlwind of energy and apologies. She was wearing her crisp white medical coat. Over a simple blouse, her stethoscope still draped around her neck. Despite the exhaustion that usually clung to her after long shifts at the hospital today, she was positively glowing. Her eyes were bright, her cheeks were flushed, and she carried a radiant, infectious smile that made her look like a little girl again. She slid into the booth across from me, placing her bag on the empty chair. "I am so sorry I'm late, Dad," she said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "We had a complicated appendectomy this morning, but everything went perfectly. And honestly, I feel like I am walking on air today. I have some incredible news." I forced a warm, gentle smile to my face. I squeezed her hand back, anchoring myself to the reality of her physical presence. "That is wonderful, sweetheart," I said. keeping my voice entirely smooth and unbothered. "You look exceptionally happy. Tell me everything." Victoria took a deep breath, her smile widening until it took over her entire face. "Cameron and I were talking last night." She began, her voice practically vibrating with excitement. "We were looking at all the wedding plans, the venues, the guest lists, the endless months of coordination. And we both just realized something. We do not want to wait. We do not want a massive, stressful production 6 months from now. We just want to be married. So we are moving the date up." I maintained my supportive expression, though my heart felt like a block of lead. "Oh," I said, raising an eyebrow in mild, pleasant surprise. "That is quite a change of pace. When exactly were you two thinking of doing this?" "This weekend," she announced, beaming as if she had just won the lottery. The words echoed in my mind. This weekend. The exact timeline Cameron needed to satisfy the ruthless people demanding their $10 million margin call. The pieces were locking into place with a terrifying mechanical precision. "This coming weekend," I repeated, allowing a small, perfectly calibrated chuckle to escape my lips. "That is certainly fast. Are you sure you can pull a wedding together in just a few days?" "Cameron is handling everything," she replied, her voice brimming with absolute trust. "He has connections with an exclusive country club that had a sudden cancellation. He is managing the caterers, the flowers, the officiant, everything. He told me he just wants me to show up and be his wife. He is being so incredibly romantic about it, Dad. He says he cannot wait another second to start our life together." I nodded slowly. I picked up my water glass and took a deliberate sip, using the movement to hide the violent tightening of my jaw. It was a masterpiece of manipulation. He had repackaged his desperate, frantic need for a financial bailout into a grand, sweeping, romantic gesture. And my brilliant daughter, whose entire life was dedicated to the pure, selfless act of healing others, was swallowing the poison without a single hesitation. "That is very proactive of him," I said evenly. "But what about the legalities, Victoria? Moving a wedding up by 6 months leaves very little time to finalize the paperwork. Has your legal team finished drafting the prenuptial agreement?" The vibrant joy on Victoria's face faltered for a fraction of a second. She pulled her hand back, folding it neatly in her lap. A faint blush of embarrassment colored her cheeks, but she quickly masked it with a look of defiant conviction. "About that," she said, her voice dropping a little softer, adopting that rehearsed tone I had heard during our confrontation at the hospital. "We actually decided to scrap the prenuptial agreement entirely." I let out a slow, controlled breath. I did not react. I simply tilted my head, inviting her to continue. "Cameron and I had a long, very emotional conversation about it," she explained, leaning forward as if to impress the absolute truth of her words upon me. "He told me how deeply hurt he was by the idea of a contract. He said that a marriage built on contingency plans is a marriage built on a foundation of doubt. He looked me in the eyes and said that true love should not be governed by contracts and lawyers." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. True love should not be governed by contracts. I had heard him deliver that exact line to his secret associate in the back of my Cadillac just a few hours ago, laughing about how easily she had fallen for it. He had manufactured a scene of wounded pride, and she had rushed to comfort him by surrendering every single layer of her protection. "I tore the draft up, Dad," Victoria said, her chin lifting with a stubborn, naive pride. "I ripped it to pieces right in front of him. I want him to know that I trust him implicitly. We are going to be equal partners in everything. That is what a real marriage is supposed to be." I looked at my beautiful daughter. I looked at the fierce, unyielding sincerity in her eyes, and a profound, silent grief washed over me. I remembered when she was just a little girl, bringing home injured birds and stray cats, believing with all her heart that she could save every broken thing she found. I had spent my entire adult life building a fortune to shield her from the cruelty of the world. I had fought off cutthroat executives and ruthless competitors so that she could afford to keep her soft, trusting heart. I realized in that moment that my protection had become her greatest vulnerability. I had insulated her so completely from greed and malice that she lacked the basic immune system to recognize a predator when one was standing right in front of her. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to slam my fist on the table. I wanted to shake her. I wanted to scream the truth. I wanted to tell her about the burner phone, the fake watch, the $10 million margin call, and the sinister laughter I had recorded in my car. But I looked at her stubborn posture and knew exactly what would happen if I spoke. If I pushed back now, if I accused her flawless fiancé of being a con artist, she would reject me entirely. She would run straight into his arms, marry him in secret, and lock me out of her life forever. I would lose my daughter, and Cameron would win the game. I could not afford the luxury of anger. I had to play the long game. I reached across the table and covered her hands with mine. I softened my eyes, pouring every ounce of paternal warmth I could muster into my expression. "If you are sure about this, Victoria, then I support you," I said gently. "Your happiness is the only thing that matters to me. If Cameron is the man you trust, then I will trust him too." The defensive tension instantly drained from her shoulders. She let out a long breath, a bright, relieved smile returning to her face. She squeezed my hands, tears of gratitude welling in her eyes. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered. "You have no idea how much that means to me. You are going to love him once you really get to know him. I promise." We spent the rest of the lunch discussing the rushed wedding details. I nodded. I smiled. I paid the bill. I walked her out of the restaurant and gave her a long, tight hug on the sidewalk, promising her that I would be there this weekend, ready to walk her down the aisle. I stood in the drizzle and watched her hail a cab to head back to the hospital, completely unaware that she was rushing headlong toward the edge of a cliff. As soon as her cab disappeared around the corner, my supportive smile vanished. My face settled into a mask of pure, absolute stone. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed a secure, encrypted number I had not called in over 5 years. The phone rang twice before a deep, gravelly voice answered. "Harrison." I said, my voice cold and precise. "It is Richard. I need a comprehensive forensic audit. I need bank records, offshore accounts, wire transfers, and shell company registries. I am dealing with a cornered rat who owes $10 million to the wrong people, and he is trying to use my daughter's trust fund to pay his debts. Bring the heavy artillery." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Then Harrison chuckled darkly. "Consider it done, Richard," he replied. "I will start digging." I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. Cameron Pierce thought he had manipulated a naive doctor and outsmarted a clueless old man. But he had just triggered a war with an adversary who had spent a lifetime destroying men far smarter than him. The execution was scheduled for this weekend. I needed to move faster than Cameron's desperation, faster than the wedding bells, and faster than the margin call that threatened to swallow my daughter whole. 2 hours after my lunch with Victoria, I pulled my Cadillac into the subterranean parking garage of a commercial high-rise in the financial district. It was a brutalist concrete cavern 3 levels below the bustling city streets, where the air was thick with the smell of exhaust and damp cement. The flickering fluorescent lights cast long, distorted shadows across the gray pillars. I parked in a secluded corner spot far away from the elevator banks and the security cameras. I turned off the engine and waited in the heavy, suffocating silence. I did not have to wait long. A sleek black sedan glided out of the darkness and parked precisely 2 spaces away from me. The engine cut out, and the driver's side door opened with a quiet, heavy thud. Harrison stepped into the dim light. He wore a sharp-tailored trench coat over a dark suit, his silver hair perfectly slicked back. Harrison was not a man who commanded physical space with brute force. He commanded it with a cold, terrifying intellect. He was a forensic accountant, but that title always felt grossly inadequate. Harrison was an absolute apex predator in the financial ecosystem. He did not just balance ledgers. He hunted money, tracked hidden assets across international borders, and destroyed fraudulent empires with ruthless precision. He walked over to my vehicle, his footsteps echoing sharply against the concrete floor. I rolled down the passenger window. He slid into the front seat, bringing a faint scent of expensive cologne and ozone into the cabin. We did not exchange pleasantries. Men like us men who operate in the unforgiving crosshairs of high-stakes wealth and corporate warfare do not waste breath on trivial greetings. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a manila envelope. Inside were 3 pieces of paper. The first contained the exact digits of the international burner phone number I had memorized at my dining room table. The second listed the specific financial terminology and fake corporate restructuring phrases Cameron had carelessly bragged about in the back of my car. The third document was a detailed breakdown of Victoria's $15 million trust fund, including the routing numbers and the specific clauses of the sweeping power of attorney Cameron was attempting to execute. I handed the envelope to Harrison. He took it, sliding a small, heavily encrypted tablet from his briefcase. I told him that the man my daughter was marrying on Saturday was drowning. I explained the $10 million margin call, the replica watch, and the international burner phone. I told him Cameron was planning to drain the trust fund by Monday morning to cover a catastrophic loss. Harrison opened the envelope and scanned the documents. His eyes, pale and sharp as shattered glass, absorbed the data instantly. He did not ask if I was sure. He did not question my methods or my conclusions. He simply nodded, his fingers already flying across the screen of his tablet. Watching Harrison work brought back a rush of memories from a very different lifetime. Back in the late 90s, my logistics company had been expanding rapidly across the eastern seaboard. We were acquiring smaller transport fleets, aggressively consolidating shipping routes, and building an empire. But we hit a massive, immovable brick wall in the form of a corrupt, violently entrenched union boss in Philadelphia. This man was demanding exorbitant extortion fees, threatening my drivers and paralyzing my supply chains. The local authorities were completely useless, bought and paid for by the union's deep, illicit pockets. I knew that fighting him in the light of day using lawyers and public courts would take years and cost millions in lost revenue. So I hired Harrison. We did not use bullets. We did not use threats. We used ledgers. Harrison embedded himself deep into the union's financial architecture. Operating entirely in the shadows, he traced a convoluted web of embezzled pension funds, illegal kickbacks, and offshore shell accounts. We spent 3 months meticulously gathering every single shred of evidence. We left absolutely no paper trail. We made no noise. When the trap was finally set, we did not confront the union boss. We simply mailed the completely devastating, irrefutable dossier directly to the federal authorities and leaked a copy to the union's most aggressive rival factions. The man's empire collapsed overnight. He was arrested before he even knew he was bleeding, his entire life dismantled by a ghost he never saw coming. Harrison and I shared a silent, unspoken bond forged in the crucible of that destruction. We understood that true power is invisible. We understood that the most lethal weapon in the world is a fully documented, undeniable truth deployed at the exact right second. And now I was pointing that exact same weapon directly at the fraud who was sleeping in my daughter's bed. Harrison plugged a specialized decryption drive into his tablet. The screen illuminated the dark interior of the Cadillac with a pale blue glow. He started with the burner phone number. I sat quietly listening to the hum of the ventilation system, watching the digital progress bars race across his screen. In the legitimate financial world, tracing an anonymous, prepaid international number requires court orders, subpoenas, and weeks of bureaucratic maneuvering. Harrison did not operate in the legitimate world. He bypassed the standard gateways, tunneling directly into the global telecom registries using backdoors he had spent decades cultivating. Less than 4 minutes after he began typing, the scrolling lines of code suddenly stopped. A single solid block of text appeared on the center of his screen. Harrison leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. He let out a low, humorless chuckle. "You have excellent instincts, Richard," he murmured, his voice dropping into a razor-sharp whisper. He turned the tablet so I could see the glowing screen. The burner phone was not registered to a person. It was registered to a corporate entity named Vanguard Horizon Holdings. I asked him what that meant. Harrison tapped another sequence of keys, pulling up a secondary database. Vanguard Horizon Holdings is a ghost corporation headquartered in a post office box in the Cayman Islands. He explained, his finger tracing the lines of data. But that is not the interesting part. The interesting part is the red flag attached to this corporate registry. He looked up at me, his pale eyes catching the dim light of the parking garage. The United States Securities and Exchange Commission, along with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, placed a covert monitoring hold on this specific shell company less than 3 weeks ago. Cameron is not just broke Richard. He is actively involved with an offshore entity that is currently the primary target of a massive federal investigation for international wire fraud. He was leading Victoria right into a federal prison sentence. I stared at the screen, my blood running completely cold. We had found the fatal crack in his armor. The hunt was finally coming to a rapid end. We had found the fatal crack in his armor. But knowing the truth and proving it to a woman blinded by love are two entirely different battles. Victoria would never believe a dossier of offshore accounts and wire fraud allegations if Cameron spun a convincing lie. He would play the victim. He would tell her I fabricated the documents to ruin their relationship. To break his spell over my daughter, I needed something much more visceral. I needed to capture the monster in his natural habitat, completely unaware that he was being watched. I drove the heavy Escalade to a private, highly secure garage owned by my logistics firm. I spent the entire night personally dismantling the motorized privacy partition, separating the driver from the passenger cabin. I installed a microscopic high-definition lens directly into the polished wood grain trim, making it absolutely invisible to the naked eye. I embedded a pair of military-grade, noise-canceling microphones into the leather upholstery of the rear seats. I wired the entire system to a heavily encrypted digital recorder, hidden beneath the floorboards, feeding a live stream directly to an earpiece and a secondary screen disguised as my GPS navigation unit. I tested the audio feed multiple times, ensuring that even the faintest whisper would be captured perfectly. I could not afford a single technical failure when the stakes were this high. By 3 a.m, the vehicle was a rolling confession booth. The next day dawned bright and bitterly cold. I parked the Cadillac outside Cameron's high-rise exactly 10 minutes early, wearing my immaculate uniform, my face entirely indifferent. I stood by the rear passenger door, waiting for the familiar sight of my arrogant, desperate target. But when the heavy glass doors of the lobby swung open, the established routine shattered. Cameron did not stride out alone. He was accompanied by a woman. She was tall, striking, and possessed the same polished, ruthless edge that Cameron wore like a uniform. She had sharp cheekbones, piercing green eyes, and a designer coat draped effortlessly over her shoulders. She clung to Cameron's arm, leaning into his side with a proprietary familiarity that made my stomach churn. I opened the door for them. Neither of them looked at me. To them, I was just a piece of the machinery, a silent mechanism designed to facilitate their luxurious lifestyle. I watched their reflections in the highly tinted window glass as they settled into the plush leather seats. I closed the door with a solid, satisfying thud, locking them inside my trap. I climbed into the driver's seat and pulled away from the curb, merging smoothly into the heavy morning traffic of the financial district. Behind me, the privacy partition hummed as it glided upward, sealing the rear cabin in complete acoustic isolation. I tapped a hidden switch beneath my steering column. The secondary screen on my dashboard flickered to life. The high-definition camera provided a crystal-clear, wide-angle view of the back seat. The hidden microphones activated, piping their voices directly into my right ear with pristine, terrifying clarity. The long morning commute gave them plenty of uninterrupted time to discuss their dark secrets. I kept my eyes fixed on the taillights ahead of me. I regulated my breathing, slowing my heart rate down to a steady rhythmic beat. I was no longer a father driving his daughter's fiancé. I was a predator, waiting patiently in the brush, completely invisible, watching the prey wander directly into the kill zone. I knew that the slightest reaction, a sudden stop, or a glance in the rearview mirror, would instantly alert them. I remained absolutely dead silent, letting the digital recorder capture every single whispered breath. "Are you absolutely certain the old man bought it?" the woman asked. Her voice was smooth, cultured, and laced with a profound, icy cynicism. She kicked off her expensive heels and curled her legs beneath her on the leather seat. Cameron chuckled, a dark, smug sound that vibrated through my earpiece. "Richard is a dinosaur, Morgan." He practically thanked me for taking control of the portfolio. He sat there eating his dry roast, nodding along like a grateful peasant. He does not have the mental capacity to understand a simple tax loophole, let alone a multi-layered asset transfer. The power of attorney goes into full effect the moment the marriage certificate is stamped on Saturday. Morgan let out a soft, approving sigh. She reached over and traced the lapel of his suit jacket. And the margin call, she asked, her tone shifting to a sharp, businesslike edge. "Are they going to give us the window we need?" "I bought us the weekend," Cameron replied, leaning his head back against the seat. "It took some serious maneuvering, but the broker agreed to hold off the liquidation until Monday morning. Once I have full discretionary control of Victoria's $15 million, I can wire the $10 million to cover the short positions before the opening bell. The remaining $5 million goes directly into the Cayman accounts. We will be completely clean, and we will have a massive surplus to disappear with when the dust finally settles." I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned pure white. The leather groaned softly under my hands. Morgan was not just a mistress. She was a fully aware, actively participating co-conspirator. They were partners in a meticulously designed scheme to strip my daughter of her entire future. This was not a romance gone wrong. This was a financial execution. Morgan laughed, a sharp, delighted sound that cut through the silence of the cabin. She poured 2 glasses of sparkling water from the minibar, handing one to Cameron. "You really are a genius," she murmured, raising her glass in mock toast. "But what about her? Are you sure you can handle playing the devoted husband all weekend?" Cameron scoffed, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated contempt. "Victoria is the easiest part of this entire operation. She is practically a ghost in her own life. She has that massive pediatric rotation starting tomorrow. She is so obsessed with playing the hero, cutting open sick kids for 24 hours straight, that she is completely oblivious to the real world." He took a sip of his water, a cruel, mocking smile spreading across his face. "Honestly, Morgan, her schedule is a blessing. Her ridiculous, long, grueling shifts give us plenty of time to enjoy her big, empty apartment. She works herself into a total coma to save lives, and while she is gone, we get free reign of her bed. It is almost too perfect." My heart stopped. The busy, chaotic world outside the windshield completely blurred into a meaningless wash of gray and red light. A cold, blinding, violent fury erupted deep in my chest, freezing the blood in my veins. They were violently mocking her very soul, turning her beautiful, selfless medical dedication into a sick, twisted, entirely unforgivable joke. The absolute, total, and complete destruction of Cameron Pierce was no longer just a simple necessity. It was now my solemn, absolute, unbreakable promise to her. I kept the heavy Cadillac moving at a perfectly smooth, even pace, mirroring the gentle flow of the morning traffic along the gray, rain-slicked streets of the financial district. To the couple lounging in the luxurious leather seats behind me, I was nothing more than an automated component of their morning routine. But inside my earpiece, the high-definition audio feed continued to transmit their every breath, their every cruel chuckle, and their every careless admission of guilt. The conversation in the back cabin shifted from mocking my daughter's noble profession to the cold, hard mechanics of their criminal enterprise. I heard the sharp, distinct click of Cameron opening the brass clasps of his expensive Italian leather briefcase. Then came the crisp, dry rustle of thick paper being pulled from a folder and spread across the center console. "Look at these," Cameron said, his voice dropping into a tone of immense self-satisfied pride. "I received the finalized drafts from the offshore notary this morning. The ink is barely dry, but the legal framework is completely bulletproof. I glanced at the hidden monitor disguised as my navigation screen. The microscopic camera captured Morgan leaning over Cameron's shoulder, her manicured finger tracing the dense paragraphs of the legal documents. Her eyes narrowed as she scanned the pages, absorbing the complex financial jargon with the practiced ease of a seasoned grifter. "Are you sure this is entirely untraceable?" Morgan asked, her voice tight with a sudden cautious edge. "The SEC has been sniffing around the perimeter of the primary fund for weeks. If they catch wind of a massive capital transfer moving into a shell corporation right before a margin collapse, they will freeze the accounts before we can even book our flights out of the country." Cameron let out a dismissive scoff, the sound perfectly captured by the military-grade microphones embedded in the upholstery. "Let them sniff," Cameron replied, leaning back and admiring his handiwork. "They are looking in completely the wrong direction. They are looking at my name, my trading history, and my corporate footprint. But my name is absolutely nowhere on these specific holding documents. I have completely insulated myself from the primary transaction." I felt a cold prickle of dread crawl up the back of my neck. I eased off the accelerator, letting the car glide to a gentle stop at a red light. I needed to hear every single syllable of his explanation. I needed to understand exactly how he planned to steal $15 million without leaving a trace of his own involvement. "Then whose name is on the guarantor line?" Morgan asked, flipping to the last page of the document. She paused, and I watched her eyes widen in sudden absolute shock. "Cameron," she whispered, her voice laced with a mixture of horror and profound, twisted admiration. "You did not." "Oh, but I absolutely did." Cameron laughed, a dark, vibrating sound that made me want to rip the partition down and strangle him with my bare hands. I needed a pristine, completely unblemished financial profile to secure the corporate guarantor loans. I needed someone with immaculate credit, a massive independent trust fund, and zero ties to the volatile trading markets. I needed Victoria. I kept my eyes fixed dead ahead on the rain-swept intersection, but my blood turned to ice. A corporate guarantor loan. The words echoed in my mind like a death knell. During the aggressive, cutthroat corporate expansion wars I fought in the late 80s and early 90s, I had seen countless men destroyed by those exact financial instruments. A guarantor loan is not a simple line of credit. It means you are legally, personally, and entirely liable for the absolute entirety of a corporate debt. If the holding company defaults, the bank does not just take the business assets. They pierce the corporate veil. They take your house, they take your savings, they take your retirement, and they take your trust funds. They strip you down to the bone. By placing Victoria on that line, he was not just stealing from her. He was legally binding her to his catastrophic $10 million failure. "But how did you get her to agree to this?" Morgan asked, staring at the signature on the page. "She is naive, Cameron, but she is not completely stupid. A pediatric surgeon does not just randomly sign a multi-million-dollar corporate liability waiver for an offshore holding company she knows absolutely nothing about." Cameron let out another booming, arrogant laugh, slapping his knee in pure delight. "That is the beauty of it, Morgan," he gloated, tapping his finger against the bottom of the page. "She did not agree to it. She has absolutely no idea this document even exists. She never read it, she never saw it, and she certainly never signed it." The light turned green. I pressed my foot down on the gas pedal, forcing my hands to remain loose and relaxed on the steering wheel, while my mind processed the sheer magnitude of his crime. "I forged it," Cameron stated proudly, leaning back and crossing his legs. "I took the signature from the trust restructuring documents she blindly signed for me last week. I traced it perfectly, line for line, curve for curve. The notary in the Caymans is on my payroll." He stamped and certified the documents without asking a single question. "As far as the international banking system is concerned, Dr. Victoria Pierce, soon to be my lovely devoted wife, is the sole managing director and primary financial guarantor of Vanguard Horizon Holdings." Morgan stared at him. Her lips parted in shock before a slow, wicked smile spread across her face. "You tied the entire collapsing fund directly to her." she said, her voice dripping with malicious awe. I tied the anchor directly around her neck. Cameron corrected his tone, turning cold and utterly ruthless. The $10 million margin call hits on Monday morning. By the time the broker realizes the primary fund is completely empty, the $15 million from Victoria's trust will have already bypassed the domestic system and landed in the offshore holding accounts. I will use $10 million to satisfy the immediate corporate debt, effectively wiping the slate clean for the creditors, and funnel the remaining $5 million into our private, untraceable wallets. I navigated the Cadillac around a tight corner, my jaw locked so tightly my teeth began to ache. The brilliance of his evil plan was staggering. He was using her own money to pay off his illicit debts, saving himself from the wrath of his dangerous associates, while simultaneously walking away with millions in pure profit. But the true horror of his scheme had not even fully materialized yet. Morgan, always the calculating predator, saw the inevitable flaw. But Cameron, she said, her voice dropping into a tense whisper, what happens when the dust settles? You are talking about moving $15 million across international borders to satisfy a margin call on a collapsed fund. The Securities and Exchange Commission will descend on your office like locusts. The federal authorities will launch a massive full-scale investigation into the wire transfers. When the feds come knocking, they are going to trace the money right back to the holding company. Cameron turned to look at her, his eyes cold, dead, and entirely devoid of human empathy. He smiled, a thin reptilian stretching of his lips. Let them come, Cameron said smoothly, his voice echoing in my earpiece with terrifying clarity. Let the SEC tear the office apart. Let the federal prosecutors subpoena every single hard drive and paper file in the building. Because when they finally trace the money, they are not going to find my name. They are going to find a holding company registered entirely, exclusively, and legally to Victoria. My breathing stopped. The steering wheel felt like rough ice under my palms. When the authorities realized the fund was a hollow shell used to launder money and commit wire fraud, Cameron continued, his voice echoing with absolute gleeful malice, they will look at the paperwork. They will see that Victoria is the managing director. They will see her signature on the guarantor loans. She will be the prime suspect in a massive multi-million-dollar federal racketeering case. They will freeze her medical license. They will drag her out of that hospital in handcuffs. She will take the absolute brunt of the federal indictment. Morgan let out a soft, breathless gasp, finally comprehending the sheer scale of the betrayal. You are framing her for the entire collapse, she whispered. She is the perfect fall guy, Cameron agreed, laughing softly as he packed the forged documents back into his briefcase. She will spend the next 20 years rotting in a federal penitentiary, trying to explain to a judge how her signature magically appeared on fraudulent wire transfers. And while she is sitting in a concrete cell, begging her public defender for a plea deal, you and I will be sitting on a private beach in the Caribbean, sipping expensive rum and living off the remaining $5 million. It is completely foolproof. I pulled the Cadillac smoothly up to the curb in front of Cameron's office building. I shifted the car into park and turned off the engine. I sat in the driver's seat, staring straight ahead through the windshield, my face a mask of absolute impenetrable stone. I had heard enough. I had recorded every single word of their evil, destructive blueprint. They thought they had engineered the perfect crime. They thought my daughter was a helpless pawn, destined to be sacrificed to save a coward. They did not realize they had just written their own death sentences. I reached down and silently saved the pristine audio file. The hunt was over. It was time for the slaughter. 48 hours before the wedding, the heavy oak doors of my home office swung open. I sat behind my mahogany desk, the surface bare except for a cup of black coffee. I had not slept since recording Cameron and Morgan conspiring in my car. I spent every waking second reviewing the audio files, listening to their cruel laughter over and over again. I needed the cold, calculating fury to keep me focused. Harrison walked into the room without knocking. He moved with the purposeful efficiency of an executioner. He reached into his briefcase, pulled out a thick dossier bound in black cardstock, and dropped it directly onto the center of my desk. The heavy thud of the paper hitting the wood sounded like a gavel, dropping in a silent courtroom. It was the physical manifestation of his absolute and complete destruction. I looked up at Harrison. His face was a grim mask, but his eyes held a dark, predatory gleam. He sat down and told me that the entire hedge fund was nothing more than a textbook Ponzi scheme. There were no legitimate corporate holdings, no high-yield technology investments, and absolutely no complex offshore tax havens operating within the boundaries of the law. Cameron was just a charismatic grifter who had spent the last 5 years robbing Peter to pay Paul. I flipped open the heavy black cover of the dossier. As I began to scan the documents, my mind automatically shifted into the ruthless gear I had used decades ago when dissecting hostile takeover bids. Back then, I would spend days locked in a boardroom, tearing through thousands of pages of corporate ledgers to find the hidden weaknesses of my competitors. I knew exactly how to spot inflated revenue projections and hidden liabilities. Looking at Cameron's records, the sheer scale of his incompetence and desperation was entirely staggering. Harrison leaned forward, his voice a low, steady rumble. He told me that the primary fund had collapsed over 2 years ago. Cameron had made incredibly stupid, highly leveraged bets on volatile pharmaceutical stocks that went completely belly up. To cover his massive losses and maintain his luxurious lifestyle, he had started borrowing heavily from shadow lenders. He was not just dealing with aggressive corporate banks. He had taken capital from the worst kind of underground syndicates. The $10 million margin call I had heard him panicking about was only a fraction of the picture. I turned the page, locking onto a summarized ledger of outstanding debts. The numbers were printed in stark, unforgiving red ink. Cameron owed a staggering total of $15 million. He owed it to extremely dangerous, exceptionally violent people who did not accept apologies or delayed payment plans. These were men who settled debts with broken bones. Cameron was living on borrowed time, projecting an aura of wealth, while a highly coordinated criminal syndicate tightened the noose around his neck. The reality of the situation washed over me with a sickening clarity. He had targeted Victoria specifically because her trust fund was the exact amount he needed to wipe his slate clean. He had manipulated her exhaustion and fed her a fabricated romance just to get his hands on the keys to her fortune. He had rushed the wedding timeline and convinced her to destroy the prenuptial agreement, all while actively plotting to forge her signature on corporate guarantor documents that would legally bind her to his massive criminal debts. He was going to feed my daughter to the wolves. My breathing remained perfectly even. The executive inside me, the man who had built a logistics empire through sheer force of will, was fully awake. I flipped through the remaining pages, absorbing every bank statement and encrypted email Harrison had managed to extract from the dark web. We possessed enough irrefutable evidence to put Cameron in a federal penitentiary for the rest of his natural life. But federal prison was far too slow, and it was far too merciful. I needed a much more immediate and devastating resolution. I closed the main file and looked back up at Harrison. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a single neatly folded sheet of paper. He slid it across the polished mahogany desk toward me. He did not smile, but the hard, knowing glint in his eye told me this was the final nail in the coffin. Harrison told me to look at the flight manifest. He explained that he tapped into the private aviation registries at Midway International Airport this morning. Cameron had not just been planning to wire the stolen funds directly into his hidden offshore accounts. He had been planning his physical escape down to the exact minute. I unfolded the crisp white paper. It was a confirmed booking for a mid-sized luxury private jet. The passengers listed were Cameron Pierce and Morgan Hayes. The destination was a small private airstrip in the Cayman Islands. But it was the scheduled departure time that made my blood run completely cold. The flight was booked for 11 o'clock at night on this coming Saturday. I stared at the black ink on the page. 11 o'clock on Saturday night. That was exactly 2 hours after the wedding reception was scheduled to begin at the country club. The pieces of his vile puzzle finally formed a complete and horrific picture. He was never going to take Victoria on a honeymoon. He was never going to build a life with her. He was going to stand at the altar, look her in the eyes, and swear to love her forever. He was going to drink champagne and celebrate the filing of the marriage certificate, giving him access to her $15 million trust fund. And then, while she was busy greeting guests and reveling in what she believed was the happiest night of her entire life, he was going to slip out the back door. He and Morgan were going to drive straight to the airport, board a private jet, and disappear into the Caribbean night with every single penny she owned. He was going to leave my trusting daughter abandoned in her white wedding dress at her own reception, waiting for a husband who was never coming back. And by Monday morning, the federal authorities would be kicking down her door, holding the forged documents that framed her for his $15 million criminal enterprise. I carefully folded the flight manifest and placed it perfectly back on the desk. I faced Harrison. He knew exactly what I was thinking. We had the evidence. We had the timeline. We had his entire playbook mapped out perfectly before us. Cameron thought he was playing an elaborate game of chess against an exhausted surgeon and a retired, uneducated chauffeur. He had no idea that I had just rewritten the rules of the entire game. I thanked Harrison for his work. I told him it was time to prepare the final stage of the operation. I was going to let Cameron walk right up to the altar, but I was going to turn his perfect escape plan into a trap he could never survive. I left the subterranean parking garage and drove directly back to Chicago Memorial Hospital. The sterile, blinding white corridors felt even colder than they had during my last visit. I did not bother stopping at the reception desk to check the surgical schedule. I knew exactly where to find her. Victoria had a small private office on the third floor of the pediatric wing, a space she used to review patient charts and catch brief moments of sleep between endless rotations. I walked past the nurse's station, keeping my posture straight and my expression completely neutral. I carried a single highly classified document inside my trench coat. It was a summarized offshore bank statement Harrison had extracted just an hour earlier. I reached her office door and pushed it open without knocking. Victoria was sitting at her desk, buried under a mountain of medical files, furiously typing on her laptop. She looked up, her brow furrowing in surprise as I stepped into the room and gently closed the door behind me. She asked me what I was doing there, reminding me that she was incredibly busy and that the rehearsal dinner was only a few hours away. I did not offer a warm greeting or a reassuring smile. I walked directly to her desk, reached into my coat, and placed the folded bank statement flat on top of her open medical charts. I told her to look at the paper. I kept my voice incredibly soft, stripping away all emotion, presenting the information with the sterile detachment of a corporate board meeting. I explained that the document was a verified financial abstract. I pointed to the glowing red numbers at the bottom of the page. I told her that the man she was planning to marry in less than 48 hours was entirely bankrupt. I explained that Cameron did not possess a massive, successful hedge fund. I told her that his primary accounts had collapsed 2 years ago and that he was currently drowning in $15 million of illicit debt. I watched her eyes track across the page. For a fleeting, agonizing second, I saw a flicker of genuine confusion shadow her exhausted face. The brilliant analytical surgeon was trying to process raw data that completely contradicted her reality. But then the psychological poison Cameron had so carefully dripped into her ear took absolute control. He had spent months isolating her, feeding her a narrative that I was an outdated paranoid relic who would try to ruin their perfect love story. He had built a fortress around her mind, and my single sheet of paper was not enough to breach the walls. Victoria violently shoved the document back across the desk. It fluttered over the edge and landed on the linoleum floor. She stood up, pushing her chair back with a harsh, grating screech. Her entire body trembled with a sudden, explosive fury. She looked at me not as a loving father, but as a hostile, bitter enemy. She asked me how I could sink so incredibly low. She demanded to know why I was fabricating documents to destroy the only man who had ever truly understood her. I stood perfectly still, letting her words hit me. She accused me of being a jealous, controlling old man who could not stand the thought of her finding happiness outside of my shadow. She said I had spent my entire life dictating every single aspect of my environment and that I was completely terrified of Cameron because he was a modern, successful man who did not need my money or my approval. The gaslighting had worked with terrifying perfection. He had weaponized her independence and turned it into a loaded gun aimed directly at my chest. She told me that she knew I had always looked down on Cameron because he did not fit into my rigid, outdated blue-collar worldview. She raised her voice, her words echoing off the small walls of the office, accusing me of hiring cheap private investigators to forge bank statements just to satisfy my own pathetic ego. She told me that Cameron had warned her I might try something exactly like this. She said he had predicted my jealousy and prepared her for my inevitable attempt to sabotage their wedding. I took the verbal abuse without flinching. I did not raise my voice in defense. I did not scream that she was walking into a trap. I stood there absorbing every single ounce of her misplaced hatred, remembering the fierce tantrums of her teenage years. When she was 16, she used to scream that I was ruining her life over missed curfews and grounded weekends. Back then, the stakes were incredibly small, just the growing pains of a young woman testing the boundaries of the world. But this was an entirely different battlefield. This was a matter of total financial ruin and federal prison. This was a matter of life and death. I watched her chest heave as she gasped for breath, her face flushed with defensive rage. I realized with crystal clarity that presenting papers and logic would never break the hypnotic spell Cameron had cast over her. She was far too deeply entrenched in his fabricated reality. If I continued to argue with her, I would only reinforce the exact narrative he had constructed. She did not need to read the truth on a piece of stolen paper. She needed to see the monster's face with her own 2 eyes. She needed to witness his betrayal in real time, stripped of all his charming smiles and empty promises. I bent down silently, picked up the bank statement from the floor, and slid it back into my coat pocket. I looked at my daughter, allowing a deep, profound sorrow to fill my eyes. I told her I was sorry for upsetting her. Victoria pointed a shaking finger toward the door. She told me to get out of her office. She said she could not even look at me right now. She told me that I was completely suffocating her and that I had ruined what was supposed to be a joyous day. Then she delivered the final, devastating blow. She told me that I was uninvited from the wedding. She said she absolutely refused to have a toxic, jealous man walking her down the aisle. She told me to stay far away from the rehearsal dinner tonight and to leave her and Cameron alone forever. I gave her one last silent nod. I turned around and walked out of the office, letting the heavy door click shut behind me. I marched down the bright hospital corridor, ignoring the nurses and patients passing by. The sorrow vanished from my face, instantly replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. I had given her a chance to see the truth quietly, but she had chosen the illusion. I reached the elevator bank and pulled my phone from my pocket. I dialed his number. Harrison answered on the first ring. "She is completely blind," I said, my voice echoing with a dark, absolute certainty. The quiet approach failed. "We execute the nuclear option tonight at the rehearsal dinner." I ended the call with Harrison and stepped out of the hospital into the freezing afternoon air. The agonizing sorrow that had weighed down my chest for the past 48 hours instantly evaporated. The grieving, desperate father who had tried to gently coax his daughter away from the edge of the cliff was completely gone. In his place stood the ruthless, calculating executive who had built a massive logistics empire by crushing adversaries without a single drop of mercy. I walked to my car, my mind shifting gears with a cold, mechanical precision. For months I had played the role of the docile, uneducated chauffeur. I had allowed Cameron to patronize me, to mock me, to treat me like an invisible piece of the scenery, while he operated his miserable con. But the time for playing the helpless old man was officially over. I drove straight to my private command center, a heavily secured office located on the top floor of a commercial high-rise I owned under a silent corporate shell name. I locked the heavy oak doors behind me and walked over to my massive mahogany desk. I opened my encrypted laptop and laid out the forensic dossier Harrison had painstakingly compiled right next to the digital recorder containing the audio from the back seat of my Cadillac. The tools of his destruction were ready. I did not call local law enforcement. Local police departments were far too slow, far too bureaucratic, and entirely unequipped to handle a $15 million international wire fraud conspiracy. Instead, I activated my real network. Over 3 decades of navigating the absolute highest tiers of corporate warfare, I had cultivated deep ironclad relationships with men and women who wielded immense federal power. I picked up my secure phone and dialed a private unlisted number in Washington. The man who answered the line was a senior federal prosecutor, a highly influential official whose entire early career I had quietly backed when he was just an ambitious assistant district attorney. I did not waste time with pleasantries or unnecessary introductions. I told him I had a massive, fully documented gift for his ongoing, highly classified investigation into Vanguard Horizon Holdings. I hit the send key on my laptop, transmitting the massive, heavily encrypted forensic dossier directly to his secure federal server. I sent the offshore bank statements, the hidden routing numbers, the forged corporate guarantor documents bearing my daughter's signature, and the private flight manifest proving Cameron's imminent escape to the Cayman Islands. But paper trails can often be debated and delayed by expensive defense attorneys. I needed to hand the federal prosecutor an absolute, undeniable death blow, so I attached the pristine audio recording from the modified privacy partition of my vehicle. I told the prosecutor to put me on speakerphone and listen to the man who had been outsmarting his entire federal agency for months. For the next 10 minutes, the phone line was completely silent, as the prosecutor and his specialized team listened to Cameron and Morgan gleefully detail their plan to frame a pediatric surgeon and abscond with stolen millions. When the audio file finally finished playing, I heard the sharp, unmistakable sound of the prosecutor exhaling a long, heavy breath. He told me that his task force had been chasing the Vanguard Horizon Holdings network for nearly 2 years, desperately trying to find the specific domestic link that connected the offshore shell accounts to the fraudulent margin calls. He said I had just handed them the absolute holy grail on a silver platter. I told him I did not just want a quiet indictment filed next week. I wanted a highly public tactical execution tonight. I explained that the rehearsal dinner was taking place at the exclusive Oakfield Country Club in exactly 4 hours. I wanted the entire luxury venue completely surrounded by federal agents. I wanted Cameron Pierce placed in heavy steel handcuffs before the catering staff even served the expensive appetizers. The pacing of the entire operation suddenly shifted into a blinding, terrifying speed. The federal prosecutor immediately conferenced in the regional director of the FBI Financial Crimes Task Force. Within minutes, the massive, invisible machinery of the United States federal government ground into violent, unstoppable motion. Warrants that usually took weeks to draft and process were fast-tracked by an emergency federal judge operating on standby. Highly trained strike teams were rapidly assembled, and dozens of plainclothes agents were dispatched to quietly lock down the perimeter of the sprawling country club. They coordinated directly with Harrison, integrating our private forensic data directly into their tactical briefing to ensure absolutely no detail was overlooked. The net was being drawn incredibly tight, and Cameron had absolutely no idea that the jaws of the trap were already closing around him. He truly thought he was walking into a grand room full of adoring guests to celebrate his impending victory. He was actually walking blindfolded into an inescapable federal ambush. I sat back in my leather executive chair, watching the pale winter sun dip below the city skyline, casting long dark shadows across my quiet office. My encrypted phone buzzed with a direct incoming message from the FBI Task Force Director. The strike team was successfully in position. The perimeter was entirely secure. Absolutely no one would leave the country club grounds tonight, without passing through a heavily armed federal checkpoint. I looked down at the dark, silent screen of my phone, my thoughts drifting painfully back to Victoria. I knew that what was about to happen would shatter her heart into 1,000 pieces. I knew that she would experience a level of profound public humiliation and devastating betrayal that would undoubtedly leave deep emotional scars for years to come. She would hate me fiercely for bringing the federal hammer down on her perfect fairy tale wedding weekend. But I also knew that her temporary, blinding hatred was a remarkably cheap price to pay for saving her actual life. If I let her walk down that flower-covered aisle tomorrow afternoon, she would inevitably end up in a federal penitentiary. Her hard-earned medical license permanently revoked, her brilliant future completely obliterated by a ruthless monster who had targeted her simply because she possessed a kind, trusting heart. I could not protect my little girl from the painful agony of a broken heart, but I could absolutely protect her from the permanent devastation of a ruined life. I stood up from my desk, my mind perfectly clear, my paternal resolve forged in absolute unbreakable steel. I walked over to the closet in the corner of my office and opened the heavy wooden door. Hanging inside, perfectly pressed and immaculately clean, was my dark driver's uniform. I took off my tailored executive suit and began to dress. I buttoned the crisp white shirt, fastened the dark tie around my collar, and slipped my arms into the heavy, familiar jacket. I stood in front of the full-length mirror and carefully placed the chauffeur's cap on my head, adjusting the stiff brim until it sat perfectly level over my eyes. Tonight, the Invisible Man was going to take center stage. The Oakfield Country Club was a fortress of old money and manufactured elegance. I parked my Cadillac just outside the Grand Valet entrance, ignoring the confused shouts of the parking attendants. Through the massive bay windows of the main banquet hall, I could see the rehearsal dinner in full swing. 200 high society guests were seated at tables draped in heavy white linen, surrounded by towering floral arrangements and glittering crystal chandeliers. Waiters in pristine white jackets glided seamlessly between the tables, pouring expensive champagne into delicate fluted glasses. It was a perfectly choreographed illusion of prosperity and grace. At the very front of the room, standing behind an ornate wooden podium, was Cameron Pierce. He held a microphone in one hand and a glass of champagne in the other, bathed in a warm golden spotlight. I stood in the cold shadows outside the glass, watching his lips move, knowing exactly what kind of poison he was pouring into the room. I pulled open the heavy brass handle of the side service door and stepped into the main corridor. The muffled sound of laughter and applause drifted through the walls. I moved forward with absolute certainty, my dark chauffeur uniform blending into the shadows of the hallway. I carried a thick, heavy leather binder tucked securely under my left arm. Inside that heavy binder was the complete unredacted forensic dossier, the offshore bank statements, the forged corporate guarantor documents, and a transcript of the audio recording that would end his life as a free man. I approached the massive double doors leading directly into the center of the banquet hall. I paused for a fraction of a second, listening to the amplified sound of Cameron's voice echoing through the grand room. He was delivering his toast. His tone was a masterful display of manufactured vulnerability. He spoke about how the corporate world had hardened his heart, how he had spent years climbing the ruthless ladders of the financial district, surrounded by people who only cared about profit and leverage. He paused, letting the silence hang in the air for maximum dramatic effect, before turning his gaze downward to where my daughter sat at the head table. He told the audience that Victoria was the light that had finally pierced his darkness. He called her his savior and his angel. He said that watching her dedicate her life to healing others had inspired him to become a better man, a man worthy of her incredibly pure, selfless heart. He raised his glass to her, pledging to spend the rest of his life protecting her, honoring her, and building a foundation of absolute, unbreakable trust. The entire room erupted into a collective, adoring sigh. Victoria was absolutely beaming, tears of pure joy glittering in her eyes as she looked up at the man who was actively plotting to destroy her. The sheer, unadulterated hypocrisy of his words tasted like ash in the back of my throat. He was calling her his savior, fully knowing that he was using her signature as a financial human shield. I placed both of my hands flat against the polished wood of the double doors. I pushed them open with a single violent shove. The heavy doors swung outward, hitting the wall stops with a sharp, resounding crack that echoed like a gunshot over the gentle instrumental music playing from the string quartet in the corner. The grand banquet hall instantly fell completely silent. 200 heads turned simultaneously toward the back of the room. I stepped forward over the threshold and into the bright light. I did not wear a tailored tuxedo. I did not blend in with the sea of designer gowns and expensive suits. I stood there in my crisp, dark chauffeur uniform, my polished black shoes gleaming under the chandeliers, my driver cap set firmly on my head. I held the thick leather binder tightly against my side. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing, the final notes dying out in a discordant, confused screech. The silence in the room became incredibly heavy, thick with sudden tension and absolute confusion. I kept my posture rigidly straight and began to walk. I moved deliberately down the center aisle, placing one foot in front of the other, with a slow, measured, and entirely terrifying rhythm. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd, like a sudden gust of wind over dry grass. The wealthy guests leaned into each other, their eyes darting from my uniform to the podium, trying to comprehend why a common driver was interrupting the most exclusive social event of the season. I ignored them all. I kept my eyes locked directly on the front of the room. As I reached the midpoint of the center aisle, I saw Victoria stand up from her chair at the head table. The joyful glow completely vanished from her face, instantly replaced by a mask of profound shock and deep, agonizing embarrassment. Her hands trembled as she clutched her expensive silk napkin. She opened her mouth to speak, to yell at me to leave, but the words seemed caught in her throat. She had told me I was uninvited. She had banished the toxic, jealous old man from her perfect fairy tale. Yet here I was, dressed as the hired help, marching directly into the heart of her new reality. Cameron stood frozen at the podium. His practiced, charismatic smile melted away, leaving a rigid expression of intense, aristocratic annoyance. He looked down at me with the absolute disdain of a king observing a peasant who had wandered into the royal court. He did not recognize the danger. He only saw a broken, uneducated father making a pathetic, desperate scene. He lowered his champagne glass and gripped the microphone tightly. He cleared his throat, projecting his voice over the murmuring crowd, attempting to regain control of the room with an air of amused, condescending authority. "Security," Cameron barked into the microphone, his voice echoing sharply off the high ceilings. "Who let this driver in here? We have a private event taking place. Get this old man out of this hall immediately before I have him arrested for trespassing." Two large security guards in dark suits immediately stepped out from their stations near the kitchen doors, moving quickly toward the center aisle to intercept me. I did not break my stride. I did not look at the guards. I kept my eyes fixed dead on Cameron, projecting an aura of such absolute unyielding authority that the guards instinctively hesitated, slowing their pace as they approached. I ignored their presence. I stopped right in front of the elevated wooden podium, breaking the barrier of his spotlight. The entire banquet hall held its collective breath. I placed the thick leather binder onto the polished table with a heavy, definitive thud. I looked Cameron dead in the eye, allowing the crushing weight of my true identity to radiate through the suffocating silence. I spoke clearly, my voice loud enough for them to hear. "You have sat in the back of my car for 3 months, Cameron. Are you telling me you still do not recognize your own father-in-law?" Cameron stood frozen behind the ornate wooden podium. The arrogant, condescending smile that had been plastered across his face just seconds ago shattered into a million invisible pieces. The color drained from his cheeks so rapidly that his skin took on a sickening, translucent pallor. His mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish pulled onto dry land, unable to form a single coherent syllable. He stared at my face, my posture, and my eyes finally piercing through the psychological blind spot he had constructed around the hired help. The realization hit him with the physical force of a freight train. The clueless, uneducated chauffeur he had spent 3 months mocking was the very man whose fortune he was attempting to steal. A collective gasp rippled through the grand banquet hall. 200 high society guests shifted in their seats, the clinking of crystal and silver completely ceasing. The silence was absolute, heavy and suffocating. At the head table, Victoria remained standing, paralyzed by the sudden shift in reality. Her hands gripped the edge of the linen-covered table so tightly her knuckles were white. Her gaze darted frantically between my stoic face and Cameron's terrified expression. She was desperately trying to bridge the massive cognitive dissonance between her loving father and the invisible driver she had ignored in the hospital driveway. I did not raise my voice. I did not shout or wave my hands in a frantic display of emotion. The time for anger had passed. I moved with the absolute chilling calm of a man who had already won the war. I picked up the thick leather binder from the podium, brushing past Cameron as if he were nothing more than a minor obstruction. I walked purposefully toward the elevated stage in the corner of the room, where the event DJ was stationed. The young man behind the soundboard looked absolutely terrified as I approached him. I did not ask for his permission. I reached into my uniform pocket, retrieved a small encrypted USB drive, and plugged it directly into the primary audio interface console. I tapped a sequence of commands on his mixing board, routing the output through the massive high-fidelity speakers suspended around the perimeter of the banquet hall. I pressed a single button. The sharp, crystal-clear audio of the morning commute flooded the vast, silent room. The acoustics of the country club were magnificent, carrying the crisp, undeniably authentic voices of Cameron Pierce and Morgan Hayes to every single corner of the venue. The guests sat completely paralyzed as Cameron's recorded voice echoed off the glowing crystal chandeliers, bragging aloud about forging Victoria's signature on corporate guarantor loans. They heard his dark, cruel laughter as he mocked her grueling 24-hour pediatric surgical shifts, twisting her selfless dedication into a convenient excuse to sleep with his mistress in her apartment. But the true horror, the absolute venom of his betrayal, echoed through the room when Morgan asked about the federal investigation. Cameron's recorded voice filled the hall with terrifying, malicious glee. He laid out the entire blueprint for everyone to hear. He explained exactly how he had set Victoria up to be the prime suspect when the Securities and Exchange Commission raided his hollow hedge fund. He boldly proclaimed that she would face 20 years in a federal penitentiary, taking the absolute brunt of the racketeering indictment, while he and Morgan escaped to a private beach in the Caribbean with the remaining $5 million. I turned away from the soundboard and looked directly at my daughter. I watched the exact moment her entire reality violently collapsed. The psychological fortress Cameron had built around her mind completely disintegrated under the crushing, undeniable weight of his own voice. The color vanished from her face. Her chest heaved with rapid, shallow gasps as the sheer scale of the betrayal struck her soul. She was not just losing a fiancé. She was realizing that the man she loved had meticulously orchestrated her complete destruction. The sudden, agonizing shock overwhelmed her physical senses. Her knees buckled beneath her. She let out a soft, agonizing cry and began to fall. I did not hesitate. The relentless executive vanished, and I was instantly her father again. I closed the distance between us in 3 massive strides, sweeping past the stunned guests and the paralyzed groomsmen. I reached the head table just as she collapsed, catching her securely in my arms before she could hit the hardwood floor. I pulled her trembling body tightly against my chest, wrapping my arms around her in a fiercely protective embrace. She buried her face into the dark fabric of my chauffeur uniform, sobbing with a violent, heartbreaking intensity. I held her, stroking her hair, anchoring her to the ground. I whispered into her ear that she was safe, that I had her, and that no one was ever going to hurt her again. I had spent my entire life shielding her from the cruelty of the world, and in that moment I became her ultimate protector once more. The grand banquet hall erupted into absolute pandemonium. The stunned silence gave way to shouts of outrage and sheer disbelief. Guests leaped out of their chairs, knocking over expensive crystal glasses and floral centerpieces. Voices clashed and echoed as the reality of the recording set in. Guests pointed directly at the stage, their faces twisting with deep disgust and anger as they finally processed the full magnitude of his terrible, unforgivable crime. At the podium, the paralyzing shock holding Cameron completely shattered. The polished, charismatic hedge fund manager dissolved into a frantic, cornered animal. He looked around the room, his eyes wide and wild with terror, realizing that his grand illusion had been permanently destroyed in front of the most powerful people in the city. He completely dropped the expensive wireless microphone. It hit the polished wooden floor with a loud, piercing feedback screech that cut through the loud, shouting crowd. Cameron frantically scrambled down from the elevated stage, his perfectly tailored, expensive suit jacket bunching up awkwardly around his tense shoulders. He began shoving violently past the beautifully decorated tables, knocking over chairs and pushing terrified guests out of his way in a desperate sprint toward the heavy main exit doors. His pale face was deeply contorted in absolute primal panic. He waved his shaking hands frantically in the cold air, his desperate voice cracking terribly as he screamed over the rising chaos. He desperately shouted that it was all a terrible lie. He loudly screamed that the crystal-clear audio was a massive deepfake, an artificial intelligence fabrication deliberately designed by a jealous, psychotic old man to entirely ruin his successful life. He pushed harder, clawing his way through the crowd, desperate to reach the dark, raining night outside. He truly believed he could still run. He truly believed he could still escape the consequences of his actions. He was so completely consumed by his own desperate need for self-preservation that he failed to notice the heavy, ominous shadows moving just beyond the glass double doors of the main entrance. He was rushing blindly into the absolute center of a trap he could never outrun, screaming his pathetic, transparent lies to a room full of people who finally saw him for exactly what he truly was. Cameron's outstretched hands were inches away from the polished brass handles of the main exit doors when the trap finally sprang shut. He did not even have the chance to touch the glass. The heavy double doors were violently thrust open from the outside, swinging inward with a concussive boom that echoed over the chaotic shouting of the banquet hall. A flood of dark figures poured through the entrance, moving with the terrifying, synchronized precision of a highly trained federal strike team. They wore heavy tactical vests emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The illusion of the ultra-exclusive rehearsal dinner was completely shattered in a fraction of a second. The elegant country club, a sanctuary built for the wealthy elite, was instantly transformed into an active federal crime scene. Agents fanned out across the room, shouting crisp, authoritative commands that cut through the panic like a blade. The 200 high society guests, the very people Cameron had invited to witness his grand elevation into wealth, scrambled backward in absolute shock, pressing themselves against the silk-draped tables and the floral centerpieces. They watched in sheer horror as the man who had just delivered a sickeningly sweet speech about love and devotion was met with the blunt force of federal law enforcement. Cameron stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes wide with a sudden paralyzing realization. The desperate screams died in his throat. He tried to pivot his expensive leather shoes, slipping wildly on the polished marble floor, desperately looking for another way out. There was absolutely nowhere left to run. Before he could take a single step toward the service corridor, 3 massive federal agents descended upon him. They hit him with a brutal, uncompromising force, tackling him hard onto the cold marble. The impact knocked the wind completely out of his lungs. I heard the sharp, distinct sound of his tailored suit jacket ripping at the shoulder. His cheek smashed against the floor, and his arms were violently twisted behind his back. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists with a loud final and deeply satisfying snap. He writhed on the ground, gasping for air, stripped of every ounce of his manufactured charm and arrogant swagger. Across the vast room, sitting in the shadows near the back bar, Morgan had realized the danger a few seconds too late. I watched her drop her champagne glass and try to quietly slip toward the kitchen exit, hoping to blend into the terrified crowd. But Harrison and the task force had left absolutely no loose ends. Two plainclothes agents intercepted her before she made it past the ice sculptures. She tried to pull away her icy, cynical composure, cracking into pure panic as they forced her hands behind her back. The woman who had ruthlessly laughed about framing my daughter for wire fraud was now weeping in terror as the cold steel locked around her wrists. I stood perfectly still near the podium, the heavy leather binder resting firmly under my left arm. I looked down at Cameron, watching him struggle pathetically against the grip of the federal agents. The transformation within my own soul was absolute. I was no longer the grieving, desperate father, desperately trying to warn a daughter who refused to listen. I was the relentless corporate executive who had just successfully executed the most critical hostility takeover of my entire career. I had navigated the treacherous waters of his deceit, absorbed his insults, and worn the humiliating disguise of a helpless old chauffeur, all to ensure that this precise moment occurred exactly as I had designed it. The lead FBI task force director, a tall man with a stern, weathered face, walked purposefully down the center aisle, ignoring the whispers of the stunned socialites. He stopped right in front of me and gave a brief, respectful nod. I extended my arm and handed the massive forensic dossier directly into his waiting hands. I told him that every single piece of the puzzle was inside that binder. The offshore routing numbers, the Cayman Islands shell company registries, the flight manifests, and the pristine audio recordings of their entire criminal conspiracy. I told him the dismantling was officially complete. The director secured the binder, his eyes scanning the room to ensure the targets were fully contained. He thanked me for delivering a flawless package. Two agents grabbed Cameron by the shoulders and hauled him roughly to his feet. His perfectly styled hair was plastered to his sweating forehead. A thin line of blood trickled from a scrape on his cheek where he had hit the marble floor. He looked absolutely pathetic, a hollow, empty shell of a man entirely exposed before the elite society he had tried to conquer. As the agents turned him toward the exit, his panicked eyes locked onto mine. The arrogant predator was gone, replaced entirely by a desperate, cornered coward begging for his life. He began to thrash against the agents, dragging his feet to stop their forward momentum. He screamed my name, his voice echoing with a shrill, hysterical pitch that completely disgusted me. He desperately begged for my mercy. He pleaded with me to call off the federal prosecutors, claiming that this was all a terrible mistake, that he could fix the entire mess. He shouted that he had connections, that he could liquidate his hidden assets, and that he could pay every single penny of the $15 million back into the trust fund by Monday morning. He promised that if I just gave him one more chance, he would walk away from Victoria and leave the city forever. He was offering the very money he had just stolen as a bribe for his own freedom. I stepped slowly down from the elevated stage and walked across the quiet room. The terrified guests parted silently, giving me a wide, highly respectful path. I stopped mere inches from Cameron's bleeding, terrified face. The stern agents held him firmly in place, forcing him to look directly into the eyes of the man he had called a clueless old dinosaur. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of anger, pity, or satisfaction. I leaned forward, bringing my face incredibly close to his, and delivered the final, devastating blow. I whispered that he fundamentally misunderstood the reality of the entire situation. I told him that I truly did not care about the $15 million. I told him that money was completely irrelevant to a man who possessed more wealth than he could ever possibly comprehend in 100 lifetimes. I watched the last remaining sliver of desperate hope completely drain from his wide, terrified eyes as my sharp words pierced his very soul. I leaned even closer, letting the absolute coldness of my voice freeze his rapidly pumping blood, and whispered that this was never about the money, Cameron. This was only about making absolutely certain that you spend the rest of your miserable, pathetic life rotting in a dark concrete cage, knowing that the uneducated chauffeur you blindly laughed at was the man who permanently locked the door. Cameron stared up at me from the cold marble floor, his eyes wide with an absolute unadulterated terror that completely stripped away his carefully manufactured facade. The charismatic, untouchable hedge fund manager was gone, replaced entirely by a broken, pathetic coward who finally understood the magnitude of his catastrophic miscalculation. He opened his mouth, gasping for air, but his words dissolved into a series of frantic, incoherent stammers as the federal agents hauled him upward by his bound arms. I looked at his ruined, expensive suit and the sweat pouring down his pale face. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of anger. I kept my tone perfectly level, projecting a chilling, absolute calm that echoed louder than any scream. "Your time is worth $1,000 a minute, remember," I said, throwing his own arrogant words directly back into his face. "You have 20 years in federal prison to count your loose change." The finality of my words struck him like a physical blow. He let out a loud, agonizing wail of pure despair as the federal strike team forcefully dragged him backward down the long center aisle of the grand banquet hall. He thrashed and kicked wildly, his expensive leather shoes sliding uselessly across the polished floor. But the highly trained agents held him in an unbreakable iron grip. He screamed my name over and over again, begging for mercy, promising he would return every single stolen cent, but I completely ignored his pathetic cries. I watched him disappear through the heavy double doors, his hysterical screams fading into the freezing winter night. The 200 high society guests who had gathered to celebrate his glorious triumph now stood frozen in absolute terrified silence. The fake manufactured elegance of the room had been entirely shattered. The wealthy socialites whispered in sheer horror, their eyes darting nervously toward me as they realized the uneducated chauffeur they had completely ignored was the architect of this incredible destruction. I turned away from the terrified crowd and pulled my encrypted cell phone from the inside pocket of my dark uniform jacket. The destruction of Cameron Pierce was absolutely complete, but I still had a significant amount of financial housekeeping to resolve. I dialed the direct number of my senior wealth manager, authorizing a massive coordinated cancellation of every single outstanding vendor contract tied to tomorrow afternoon. With one brief, authoritative phone call, I completely dismantled the $1 million wedding I had been secretly financing. I canceled the sprawling floral arrangements, the massive custom-catered menus, the string quartets, and the luxury venue reservations. I instructed my legal team to aggressively recoup every possible expense, invoking the fraud and criminal conspiracy clauses buried deeply within the vendor agreements. I was not going to allow a single drop of my hard-earned capital to be wasted on a ceremony designed entirely to celebrate a criminal deception. The business was officially concluded. I put my phone away and walked back toward the head table, where Victoria was still sitting on the floor, surrounded by the shattered remnants of her perfect fairy tale. She was sobbing uncontrollably, her entire body trembling with the devastating, agonizing weight of Cameron's betrayal. I knelt down beside her, ignoring the stares of the remaining guests, and gently wrapped my arms around her shaking shoulders. I did not offer empty platitudes or tell her that everything was going to be fine. I simply held her tight, letting her cry against my heavy jacket until her violent sobs slowly faded into exhausted, ragged breaths. I stood up and gently helped my daughter to her feet, supporting her weight as she leaned heavily against my side. We walked slowly down the center aisle, leaving the whispering crowd and the ruined rehearsal dinner far behind us. I guided her out of the Grand Country Club and into the freezing night air, walking her directly toward the massive black Escalade parked in the driveway. The very vehicle where Cameron had foolishly confessed his crimes had become the sanctuary that ultimately saved her life. I opened the heavy door, helped her safely inside, and drove my little girl home. The grueling, painful months that followed the rehearsal dinner crash tested our family in ways I never could have possibly anticipated. The federal trial of Cameron Pierce and Morgan Hayes was a highly publicized, relentless media spectacle that dominated the local financial news networks for weeks. The prosecution utilized the pristine audio recording from my customized privacy partition as the absolute cornerstone of their criminal case, painting a devastating, undeniable picture of their elaborate racketeering and wire fraud conspiracy. Cameron's expensive defense attorneys desperately tried to argue that he was simply a misguided victim of corporate pressure, but the overwhelming mountain of forensic evidence I had provided to the FBI task force made any chance of an acquittal completely impossible. The federal judge showed absolutely no mercy during the final sentencing hearing, handing Cameron a mandatory 25 years in a maximum security penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Morgan received 15 years for her direct complicity in the offshore shell accounts. The arrogant monster, who had tried to steal $15 million and frame my daughter, was now permanently locked away behind high concrete walls exactly where he belonged. Victoria's journey toward healing was incredibly slow and undeniably painful, but she emerged from the devastating ashes of her broken engagement with a fierce, unbreakable resilience that made me immensely proud. She stepped entirely out of her sheltered, naive shell, realizing that the world was filled with dangerous predators who would gladly exploit her trusting nature. She threw herself back into her pediatric surgical rotation with a renewed, passionate dedication, using her demanding medical career to rebuild her shattered confidence and forge a completely independent identity. She no longer allowed anyone to dictate her future or manage her massive trust fund behind her back. With Harrison's expert guidance and my quiet, steady support, Victoria took absolute control of her own financial portfolio, learning the intricate, complex details of asset management and corporate logistics. She transformed her painful, humiliating trauma into a powerful, protective armor, ensuring that no man would ever successfully deceive her or manipulate her generous heart ever again. As for me, I officially retired my dark chauffeur uniform and the heavy black driver's cap. I did not drive the customized Escalade anymore. That final unforgettable shift had been my absolute masterpiece, a flawless, perfectly executed operation that successfully neutralized a massive threat and saved my family from utter ruin. I relocated to my private, secluded wooden cabin, nestled deep within the quiet, towering pine trees of the northern mountains. I sit on my wide wooden porch every evening holding a warm cup of coffee, watching the brilliant orange and purple sunset dip slowly beneath the distant, jagged horizon. The relentless, high-stakes corporate warfare and the dangerous, hidden deceptions are finally behind me. I listen to the gentle rustling wind moving peacefully through the dark forest, knowing my daughter is safe, our massive legacy is completely secure, and my long work as the invisible, silent protector is definitively done forever. When you spend your life providing for your family, you assume your sacrifices build a fortress around them. But money is just paper. It cannot buy character, and it cannot buy true intentions. The greatest danger does not break down your front door. It walks in smiling, dressed in a tailored suit, holding your daughter's hand. Never let your wealth blind your instincts. Never ignore the quiet disrespect shown to the people who serve. A man's true nature is not revealed in how he treats his equals, but in how he treats the invisible people he thinks are beneath him. Have you ever caught someone showing their true toxic colors when they thought no one was watching? How did you expose them? Drop your story in the comments below. If this father's brutal revenge satisfied you, hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and stay tuned for the